Baruch Hashem. Today's daf yomi is Sanhedrin Nun Dalet, Sanhedrin 54, and today's daf yomi is dedicated for Shmir for the Chayalim, Matzal for the Shuyim, and the Yeshua for Am Yisrael, and the Eis Sarah. So yesterday we said on 53b there was a dispute between the Rabbanan and Rabbi Yehuda in the case of circumstances where a person was mizana with their mother, who was also their father's wife. The Rabbanan said they get two violations, and Rabbi Yehuda says they get one. And the Gemara said, what's the source for Rabbi Yehuda? So Rava said that the source for Rabbi Yehuda is the fact that it says Ervas Avicha. And so he says, this is Ervas Avicha, this is the wife of your father. And so and then it says Ervas Imcha Segila Imchahi. So because it says Imchahi, you're only liable for your mother and not for being your father's wife. So now the Gemara on top of 54a is going to cite a brisa that's 15 lines long, a very long brisa, which is going to prove the position of Rava's explanation of Rabbi Yehuda. Naya Kavasa de Rava, so that the brisa supports Rava. It says Ish, the man who commits adultery, Pratlakatan, excluding a minor who commits adultery, is not liable. Asher Yishkavas Eshes Aviv, who is with his father's wife, Mashma Bein Eshes Aviv She'imo Bein Eshes Aviv Shaloimo, whether it's his father's wife, whether she's his mother, she's his mother or not. Imo She'eno Eshes Aviv Minayin. How do we know if his mother is not his father's wife? How do we know he's also liable? Tam Omar Ervas Aviv Kila. It says the nakedness of his father is revealed. Mufna Ha'akish V'adumi Menu Gzera Shava. So we compare his mother, whether she's his father's wife or not. Mosi Masu, it says he'll put to death Beskila with stoning. I told him maybe it's one of the other deaths. So it says here it says in this case the Mehembam in this pasuk V'nemar Va'ovidoni Demeyan Bam Malawam Beskila Afkam Beskila. So we compare it to Ovidoni, just like there it's stoning also here. Onesh Shamanu Asaraminai. And so we know that this is the punishment. How do we know that there's a warning against them? Now Momer Ervas Avicha Losigale Erveris Avicha. This refers to Ervas Avicha Losigale. Ervas Avicha, what does that mean? Du Eishes Avicha, that's your father's wife. I told Mer Eishes Avicha, I know Ervas Avicha Mamash, maybe means actually being with your father. So Nemar Kan Ervas Avicha Losigale. It says here Ervas Avicha Losigale. And Nemar One Ervas Aviv Gila. Ma'awan, just like over there, Be'ishus Akasimidara, it's talking about a marriage. Avkam Be'ishus. So just like over there, it's talking about Ishus. Basically with like a husband and a wife, that's what it's referring to, that prohibition. Also here it's talking about that prohibition. Mashma bein eishes aviv shehi imo, bein eishes aviv shehi eino imo. And so that implies whether she's his mother, his father's wife, who is his mother, or is not his mother. Imo she'eno eishes aviv minai. And how do we know his mother is not his father's wife? Tam omer ervat simcha lo segala. Your nakedness of your mother one should not reveal. Eli ela ba'azara. I only know that this is a Bazara Asakas of Imo Shena Ishus Aviv, Kimo Sheishus Aviv, Onesh Mina. And how do we know the mother who's not your father's wife? How do we know that the punishment is also this is there's also a punishment? So it says Nemar Kan Ervas Avicha was to go and Nemar Wa'alan Ervas Aviv Gila. Bazara Asakas of Imo Shena Ishus of Kimo Sheishus Aviv, Onesh Asakas of Imo Shena Ishus of So they compare it to tell us that it looks at it as though your mother, whether or not she's your father's wife or not. And then it says imchahi. Then the brisa says, the pasuk says, she is your mother. Mishum imo mishum eshasav. So that's exactly what Rava said is the source for Rabbi Yehuda, because it says imchahi, for you're liable because she's your mother, but you're not liable because she's your father's wife. And that's the source for Rabbi Yehuda according to Rava. For Rabbanan, the Rabbanan, what do they say? Ervas Avicha. And according to the Rabbanan who argue with Rabbi Yehuda, and they say that somebody who's with their father's wife is liable for two prohibitions. Why do they not learn it out from Imchahi? Why do they not learn out? Why don't they learn out from Imchahi? Rabbanan on the position, Ervas Avicha means to say mamish, your father, means say it's a prohibition in sleeping with your father. The Gemara says, you had a question, Jeff? Right.
This says
yeah. So now they're going to ask that question. Yeah, well, they're going to say, well, they're basically, it's a good question. They're basically bothered by that because they say, why do we need Erva Savicha? Hi. Erva Savicha, hi, Mevia Zachar Nafka. So why do we need to say you're not allowed to be with your father? We're going out, you're not allowed to be with any man. So the Gemara says, it's to say you're liable for two. Because Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar Rabbi Yehuda, like the teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, Nachri Abal Aviv Chayev Shtayim. If Nachri, who's typically translated as a non-Jew, is with one's father, he's liable for two. One for being with his father, one for being with a Nachri, one for being with a man. Rabbi Yehuda, Nachri Abal Aviv Chayev Shtayim. If he's with his father's brother, he's also liable too. Amarava Mistaber Milsa. So that's why he needs to teach us also that the Rabban's position. And says Rava Mistaber Milsa Rabbi Yehuda b'Yisrael b'Shogeg uvekarban. What is Rabbi Yehuda referring to? Talking about not a Nachri. Talking about a regular Jew who does this accidentally. He doesn't realize it's his father. He doesn't realize he's a man. And he's going to have to bring a carbon because he did it accidentally. And he has to bring two sacrifices. The reason why I call them a Nachri is Lishna Ma'ayu. We don't want to imagine that a Jew would do that sin. We speak in a euphemistic manner. We say it was a non-Jew. If you want to say it's an actual non-Jew, Dino, what will be his law? Niu Katoa. The non-Jew would get death for this. The non-Jew doesn't have the exemption of saying I did it by accident. And so therefore he would get death. Betray Katoa, Katlsa, you're going to kill him twice? You're not going to kill him twice. So it's obviously talking about a Jew, not a non-Jew. It's talking about an accident. That's why it matters whether it's twice or once, because the second time, the two times, refers to two sacrifices that he has to bring. You had a question, Bill? I didn't mean to put you on the spot. It looked like you're about to ask something, man. So now, we're going to get into that in tomorrow's daf. The non-Jews are required to keep these laws, and not only that, if they don't get certain exemptions that the Jews get, they get the severe penalty, and they don't get the exemption of having done it by accident that they bring a korban. So these are laws that they have to keep of the 7 Noahide laws. We'll see why in a moment. We'll see. It's really tomorrow's daf. These Tanya Namiyach, we have a brayso that tells us this as follows. Abal Aviv Chayev Shtayim. One is with his father, is liable for 2. Abal Aviv Chayev Shtayim. He's liable for 2. Ikadamri Dolok Rabbi Yehuda. Some say this is not like Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda in our Mishnah says that you're liable 1 if you're with your mother, who's your father's wife. So some say this is not. Some say this is not like Rabbi Yehuda because Rabbi Yehuda would say also in this case you're liable once. Ikadamri Afilu Tema Rabbi Yehuda, and some would say even this is Rabbi Yehuda. And he learns that from a Kal V'chomer from one's father's brother. Ma'achi Aviv, just like your father's brother, the Korva Avifu, he's a relative of your father, and Chayev Shtayim, you're liable for 2. Aviv L'Kol Shekain, then for sure by your father, you'd be liable for 2. The Kamiflugi would put to by the Rav, and this actually these two opinions about what does Rabbi Yehuda say here is the same dispute by and Rav have elsewhere. Because Mar Savar own Sheminadin, Mar Savar ain't own Sheminadin. The whole question is whether you could punish somebody from a Kal V'chomer, from a logical argument. The Torah doesn't explicitly say the punishment, but you say, well, we can make it from a Kal V'chomer, so can you apply that? So one says you can, one says no, we don't apply it because it's logic, and we can't assume a punishment on the basis of logic. Rabbanan Azaro Eishes Aviv Minalahu. How do the Rabbanan know that one cannot be with their father's wife? Nafkalu, they learned it out. They learned out from that pasuk. Your father's wife you cannot reveal. Rabbi Yehuda Amu Mibail Azaro Eishes Aviv LaAchar Misa. Rabbi Yehuda says that's teaching us that even after your father dies, you're not allowed to be with his wife. Rabbanan, whom we say for the Karnafka. The rabbis learned that idea from the end of that verse because it says Ervas Avicha He. So even after his death, Rabbi Yehuda, whom we by the way, Mishum Eishes Avat Hamachayev V'Yatom Machayev Mishum Eishes Ish. The Rabbi Yehuda says that teaches us that you're responsible for him because she's your father's wife and not because of a married woman. Where it says, "Va'anan tanana ba'al eishes av chayev mishus eishes av mishum eishes ish bein b'chayev bein la'achar misas aviv." Well, Rabbi Yehuda, but didn't we learn in the Mishnah that one is with his father's wife is liable for your father's wife and for a married woman, whether you're during your father's lifetime or whether after his death? And Rabbi Yehuda doesn't argue. So Rabbi Paul B'Braisa. So he does argue. He just doesn't argue in the Mishnah. He argues in the Braisa. Then the Gemara has another question. V'Rabbanan onesh de'eshes aviv la'achar misa minah. How do the rabbis know that if you're with your father's wife after he's dead, that you get after he dies, that you get a punishment? What's the source? Bishlam Rabbi Yehuda Ma'asu Gzeira Shava. Rabbi Yehuda derives it from a Gzeira Shava because anything the Torah warns us about is also going to get a punishment. El Rabbanan Minohu, but the Rabbanan, what's their source? So Amrecha Hu Ervas Aviv Gila. So they learn that from the fact that it says Ervas Aviv Gila. The Mapikla Rabbi Yehuda Gzeira Shava. So Rabbi Yehuda basically says that teaches us for Gzeira Shava, but but the rabbis wanted to teach us that there's a punishment for someone being with their father's wife after death. What's the Rabbanan source for the idea that there's a punishment for a woman, for his mother who's not his father's wife? This is what we referenced yesterday. She is your mother. That's the source for the punishment. That the Torah says that you're going to be punished for your mother, whether she's your father's wife or she's not your father's wife. Okay, so now Gemara says, Habal Kala. So if the Mishnah had said if one is with his son's wife, you're liable for being with your daughter-in-law and also for being with a married woman. What about also the fact that she's the wife of his son? Should be a third prohibition. So Amar Rabbi Pasach Hakasav Bekalaso V'Siyim Be'Eishes Beno. So the pasuk started with his Kalaso and finished with Eishes Beno. U'Maracha Zui Kalaso Zui Eishes Beno. This is one's daughter-in-law is the same woman as Eishes Beno, that you're only liable for one of those, not both of those. Why do we need to know how many of them you're liable for? So one possibility is for the sin offerings, but the Rambam says it's just to tell us the power of the sin, just the power of tell us even more how many prohibitions you're in violation of. Now we come to the next Mishnah. Next Mishnah is a very powerful Mishnah. Habala Zachor Vala Behema. So one who is with a male or with an animal, Vala Isha Mavias Behema, and the woman who brings an animal upon her, then the law of both of them is biskila. Then the law for both of them is they both get stoned, both the woman and the animal. So the Gemara says, well, an animal's not capable of sin. If a person sinned, how is the animal? The animal has no ability to sin. So even though typically speaking, the Mishnah does not dorish time of the crowd, doesn't give explanations for the mitzvos. I mean, you could do the daily Mishnah with Benedict, and up until now, you wouldn't have seen even one case where the Mishnah is given an explanation for a mitzvah. This is unusual that the Mishnah is, I think it's unique even. Mishnah is giving an explanation for the mitzvah. So, in fact, elsewhere, the Mishnah says you shouldn't give explanations for the mitzvah. So here you're giving an explanation for the Mishnah to tell us if a person sinned, what did the animal sin? But rather, we say because the animal caused the person to sin, even though he didn't cause it, but the sin happened as a consequence of the animal. Therefore, the Torah is saying it should be stoned. We see from here, if an animal is going to be punished for a sin taking place as a result of it, so how much more so would a human being be punished? Then the Mishnah gives a second explanation. We don't want this animal to be walking in the marketplace. This is why this is the one that caused this person to be stoned. Now, even though that person is no longer alive, still we don't want this person to have extra shame after they're dead from this animal, and so therefore we kill the animal. This reminds us of why the Midrash says Bilam's donkey was sinned, because we don't want to embarrass Bilam. But Bilam's donkey was killed because we don't embarrass Bilam by saying this is the donkey that caused Bilam to sin. Yeah, Bill. So that's the first one. That's the first answer of the Mishnah. The first answer of the Mishnah is that it caused something bad to happen to the human. Even though it didn't do the action willingly, it caused something bad to happen to the human as a result. That's the first answer of the Mishnah. That's the ox isn't born, the human's born. That's a muad. That's a muad. That's a goring ox. I don't know if we're attributing, in that case, we're not necessarily attributing intent. We're saying this is such a dangerous ox that we can't have it around. This has a predisposition to act this way. But this is just, according to the first approach, this is a different scenario than that. This is, according to the first approach, it's a sin happened through it. And according to the second approach, we don't want it to cause shame to the human being. It's not something that the animal did. I mean, the animal did it, but it's not that it has a predisposition for that.
Okay. The second reason,
Yeah.
Because people have been talking about the subject which rabbis didn't want to be talking about. You got the animal in the marketplace, people start talking about that's the animal, talking about the subject.
Yeah. It's interesting. The Mishnah doesn't say that, but that's a nice idea also. A very nice idea. So first of all, the Gemara says, what's the source of the Zachar Minon? How do we know that a male person's not allowed to be with a male? The Tana Rabbanan Ish, which says in the verse, Ish asher yishkav as Ish aviv, Ish prat l'katan asher yishkav as Zachar, which implies if he will lie. Tana Rabbanan, hold on. Zachar Minon Tan Ish prat l'katan, and then it says, I skipped on. Ish prat l'katan asher yishkav as Zachar ben gadol ben katan mishkavei isha. And so it says mishkavei isha. Oh yeah, because I was reading the wrong pasuk. Ish asher yishkav as Zachar mishkavei isha toeva asu shnehem mostu demehem bam. So Zachar Minon, so it Ish excludes a minor. Asher yishkav at Zachar ben gadol ben katan, whether it's adult or a minor. Mishkavei isha magilcha kasav sheshnei mishkavos beisha. The Torah tells us that by a woman, there's two orifices, and you're liable for both of them. And Amar Bishmo Hareza Bo Amed v'Nimtzol. We're coming to learn something out from it, and it comes to teach us something else. Meaning to say, and the pasuk itself learns something. Meaning to say that for a man you're liable once, but for a woman you're liable for two orphans. Mosi Masu Beskila, that they die by stoning. I told me Beskila, I know Allah has to call me some or maybe it's by one of the other deaths. So just like by Ovi and Tony, it's stoning at Khan Beskila. Onesh Shaman, we're on the top of 54. We heard about the punishment of Zarminai and how about the warning. You cannot lie, a man cannot lie with a woman, it's a toeva. Amanu Azara was Shochev Azara and Nishkav. So we know that the Shochev is the one who is the giver, and the Nishkav is the recipient. So how do we know the recipient is also responsible? The verse says Kadesh. That means a Kadesh. The simple explanation of it, Rashi says, it's Mizuman who Mishkav Zachar, one who's ready for Mishkav Zachar, Mibnei Yisrael, from amongst the Jewish people. And it states V'Omer, and it states V'Gam Kadesh Yabaretz Asu B'Chol Tovos Agayim Asher Horish Divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So this teaches us that this is a warning for both the shochev and the nishkav. Rabbi Kiva says, "Eino tzarach." You don't need to learn out from lo yeh kadesh. Harei omer ve'asachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha. It says a man cannot lie mishkavei isha. And the words tishkav can be read in two manners. One is lo tishkav, and that's for the shochev. V'karibe, but we read it also as tishachev, and that's for the nishkav. So behema mino, and how do we know what's the source that a person is not allowed to be with an animal? Tana Rabbanan, it says ish. It says in the pasuk isha sheritain shechvato behema motzi matzvas behema tarogo. So how do we expound this? Ish pratlakat, and that excludes a minor. Sheritain shechvato bivhema. Ben gedola ben ketana. It's an animal, whether it's an adult or a minor. Motzi mas beskiwa, they're put to death with stoning. I told me skill. I know about the companies of some over Torah. Maybe it's one of the other deaths in the Torah. Like Gemara says, "Nemar tan tarogu v'nemar olan kiarog tarkeno mala on beskill avkam beskill." So it's stoning. Amanu onesh l'shochev onesh l'nishkav. I understand if one is the giver to the animal. I don't know if they're the recipient. Tamalomer kol shochev and beima mosimas. Amenu inyo l'shochev. We already said you can't be the giver to the animal. Taneo l'nishkav. So learn it for the nishkav. So we say there's a punishment for the shochev and the nishkav asar minayin. How do we know there's a warning? So that's the source. How do we know that there's a asar against the recipient from the animal? So that's the position of Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Akiva says, "Eino tzarach." Haromer lo titein shechvatcha, and you read it lo titein shechivatecha. Actually, this pasuk was cited by the commentaries. It's a whole long story. I don't want to get into now. Maybe tomorrow by Rav Reuven Margolios as the source that artificial insemination, or what we used to call artificial insemination, now they call like in vitro fertilization, is prohibited. Is like a form of adultery. It's not how Rav Moshe Feinstein ruled. Rav Moshe Feinstein ruled against that explicitly in a controversial ruling, but some point to this source. That's for another discussion. Maybe if you remind me on Shabbos, we could discuss it, or another time. But just I want to finish at that so you can get to the daily Mishnah. Abala zachar vehivio of zachar. So let's say a person is both the giver and the recipient on one man with one mistaken thought. He didn't realize what it was. Amar Rabbi Abo, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel, Chayav Shtayim, Chada lo tishkav, Chada lo yeh kadesh. So Rabbi Shmuel says he's going to be liable for two sin offerings. One sin offering because lo tishkav, and one because of being the recipient. Or Divrei Rabbi Kiva eno chayav ala achas, because he learns it out. He says it's one prohibition, so therefore you only be liable for one sin offering. Let's say you're with an animal and you bring the animal upon you. Rabbi Shmuel learns that from two verses, so therefore you're liable for two. Whereas according to Rabbi Akiva, he learns that from the same source, the same pasuk. Abai says, even according to Rishmal, you're only liable for only one sin offering. The kiksiv lo yakadesh begavre ksiv. When it says lo yakadesh, that's with adultery with a man and not with an animal. And so therefore, Elo Rabbi Shmuel Azar Nishkav Minal. So if that's the case, what's Rabbi Shmuel's source against Azar Nishkav? So he says, not away me kol shochavim beimam motimat. He learned it out from whoever was an animal put to death. Apply to the recipient. After Rahman and Nishkav, Shochev. The Torah says the Nishkav is an expression of Shochev. Maha Shochev Anashva the Itzir, just like the giver is warned and punished, Afa Nishkav Anashva Itzir. A third distinction. Hanirbo Zachav, Hanirbo Behema, one who is the recipient from both an animal and a man with one mistaken thought. Maybe he's in a stupor. Amar Rabbi Avo, Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Chayav Shtayim. According to Rabbi Akiva, you're liable for two. Why? Because there's chad, one sin offering, is for a man, milo tishkav, v'chada milo titain shechvatacha, and the other is for the animal. Divrei Rebbe Shmuel eno chayav ha'achat, because idi v'idi lo yakadeshu, because he learns those both happen in the same verse. And Abai says the filu to Rebbe Shmuel nami chayav shtayim. So Abai says the opposite here. Even according to Rebbe Shmuel, you're liable for two. Why? One is the ksiv kol shachevim be'ema mosimas v'meinu inyo ashochev teneo inyo anishkav. So Abai said, because it says, one is because kol shachevim be'ema mosimas, and if you don't apply that to the recipient, apply it to the giver, you apply it to the recipient. Afka rachmano anishkav b'oshen shochev to tell us mas shochev anish v'azir av nishkav. All these are the prices. Abal abal zachar ve'evi zachar alav abal ve'ema ve'evi ve'ema alav. So one who's with on the male and receives it, and the animal and receives it. Bein Rabbi Avo, bein Abaye, Rabbi Shmuel chayav shalosh. According to everybody says Rabbi Shmuel says you're three. Why? One is for being with the male because that's zachar lo tishkav. One is nirbo zachar, which is lo yakadesh, and the third is on the animal chol behema lo titein shechvatcha. Rabbi Kiva says shtayim because he has both the giver and the recipient in both cases as being the same verse. So therefore, Rabbi Kiva only has two. Okay, well, we'll stop here, but before I do that, let me go back to 1 second when I was talking about the Moshe Feinstein said if one is using the in vitro fertilization, it happens a lot. Let's say if they're married. In those days, Moshe wrote this in the 50s, it was a new technology. But let's say if people are married and man cannot produce seed, and the couple wants to have the woman get pregnant, so they'll just get the seed from a bank. So is that going to be considered adultery? So Moshe Feinstein said it's not. He said, listen, it's not ideal, but he said if it's difficult circumstances, you have no choice. He said it's better to get from a non-Jewish person, so you don't have any concerns about. For multiple reasons, he said better to get from a non-Jewish person. But this was a very controversial ruling of Moshe Feinstein. A lot of people were upset with him. Some say he recanted, but he really laid the groundwork for that. I'm not saying what people should do practically, but this was those who were against it. One of the theories was based upon the idea of anything that's coming, not even the actual relations, is going to be considered adultery. Clearly, it doesn't strike me as being adultery, especially when it's like there's no act there, but this was a new technology, and this is what Moshe Feinstein was ruling. But you see that even these things, it seems like so esoteric, all these concepts, they become more and more related. The principles that they laid out in the text almost 2,000 years ago are now are being used to apply to modern technology. And this is just one more example. All right, I want to encourage everybody to go to the Daily Mission at 9:30. Yasher koach to everybody, and we'll stop here.